My name's Ian McNaught Davis, and I'm a visual artist with an interest in analog photography. My project Afterthought is an exploration of the idea of liminal space, but using analog photography to explore this concept. And I've looked at the relationship between man-made objects and natural objects in imaginary spaces. For this project, I've been using two cameras from the 1950s. They are Agfa Clacks, and these are box cameras. And I've been photographing and hand developing the films with the idea of building collages to make these imaginary landscapes where there's this idea of interplay between nature and man-made objects in the same space. I used to live in Georgia, and I worked there on assignments throughout the region. I became very interested in photographing the ruins of the former communist regime. And I think a lot of photographers fall into that, and initially I was photographing just for the sake of the visually arresting aura of ruins, and maybe photographing it for the superficial sake of any kind of dereliction or entropy. But over time there, I got more interested in the interplay between these buildings and the natural realm, and I became drawn to this tension between these two forces, this kind of senses of buildings or man-made objects relinquishing their power, and this sense of encroaching nature as well. An example of this is this photograph that I took in Salanjikha, which is a town in western Georgia. In 1985, it was the top producer of tea in the entire Soviet Union. In this particular scene, it's a ruin of an abandoned tea factory, and you have cattle exploring this once very industrious town to look for grazing. Photographing scenes like this, that I learned to see that emptiness or entropy doesn't have to be a finite endpoint, and it can mark the beginning of a state or a transition to another state beyond simply just abandonment. These manifestations of our ideals and progress, in steel or concrete, I'm drawn into blending that with a presence of leaves and chlorophyll and nature. Both of these give rise to the idea of liminal space, and liminal space being a transition between two states of being, not quite becoming yet, but sort of caught in this state of limbo. In building these imaginary landscapes that I've been doing through collaging negatives, I'm trying to show some potentiality between these two forces of nature and human ingenuity. These images have been shot in London and throughout South Africa, and the majority of them were developed and collaged in South Africa, and I didn't have any developer, and so I've started using other chemicals to develop my negatives. I've been using instant coffee, pool cleaner, salt, and vitamin C. Part of the reasons for making this a book as opposed to an online portfolio is because it just lends itself to a tactile experience. Analog photography, I think, really comes through if you can hold it and feel the texture of the print. A book is tactile, and these images are very texture driven. There's a lot of grain, there's sprocket holes, you've got overlapping layers, and this really comes across in the medium of a book than, say, being on a digital screen or a standalone print. Within the space there is that tension, and one of these forces is going to cross that threshold, and I thought showing it as a series of images would be more powerful because you can see the dynamics and the tension between these two forces if it's spread over time, and that's what making a book allows me to do. A lot of my work has trees in it, and I think trees very much embody the idea of liminal space, in that they're grounded but they're still growing. It did get me thinking a lot about life cycle against lifespan. Buildings and economic models and political regimes all have a lifespan, and a lot of those will outlast the life of a single tree. But what these objects and these ideologies don't have is a life cycle. And a tree has an ability to self-perpetuate, to produce more of its own kind. Whereas ideas and dictatorships and economic models don't. I think looking at ruins has a similar effect that looking at a night sky does. You are confronted with the enormity of history in the same way that looking at stars confronts you with the enormity of the universe. It forces you to think about time and the inevitable ending of our ideas and our creations and ultimately ourselves. Something that I want to challenge with this work is this idea of an endpoint, that we have this trajectory or an arc, and that there's a fixed ending. Looking at this idea through the presence of nature, there is this idea of a cycle, and the end isn't always as clear-cut as we think it is. In making Afterthought, there's a lot of almost meditative processes of developing the film in the dark and mixing the chemicals. And one of the questions that arose was that with our preoccupation with production and our obsession with convenience, the fact that we are sharing a liminal space with nature means that at some point one of these forces is going to overthrow each other, whether it's man-made or it is of the forces of nature. And the question is, when this threshold is inevitably crossed, because it is something that is going to happen. Which force is going to overthrow the other, and then which force is going to be the afterthought?